Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's University of Regina's 2025 Alumni Effect Virtual Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Michelle Folk. I am in Gender, Religion, and Critical Studies at the Federated Colleges, so Campion and Luther in particular, and I teach and research in the area of South Asian religious traditions. Before I introduce our speaker, I would simply like for us to acknowledge that the University of Regina is situated on the territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishtabek, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. The University of Regina and its federated colleges also are on Treaty 4 territory, and they have a presence on Treaty 6. The University of Regina's Alumni Engagement Department is pleased to be able to offer the Alumni Effect Speaker Series each month in a virtual format. I hope that your time with us today inspires you to return to future sessions or to look at sessions online. I would like to point out that the sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the U of R alumni website so that you can watch the presentations again and share them with friends, family, and others. You'll see the link to the alumni website in the chat if you'd like to access the video later. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Ralph Carl Wushke. Ralph holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Regina and is part of the U of R's first official graduating class. Ralph was honored with the Golden Aluminary status in October 2024, celebrating 50 years of connection to the U of R alumni community. Ralph went on to study at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Saskatoon and was ordained in 1978 and has since dedicated over 40 years to ministry, including serving as chaplain at the University of Toronto and founding the Queering Religion program. Ralph, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Great to see you again.
Great to see you as well. Ralph and I are familiar with each other because as part of the 50th anniversary, Ralph kindly and generously came into my Religious Studies 100 classroom and shared with students. Following our presentation, we have about 15 minutes for a question and answer session. We invite you to submit questions for Ralph in the chat, and we'll look at them after the presentation. You are welcome, of course, to leave your cameras on for the duration of the event, but please note that microphones will be muted until the end of the presentation. And if you'd like to ask a question live at the end of the presentation, please use the raise hand function at the top of your screen. And so I'll now turn everything over to Ralph.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Nice to be talking sort of to and with the prairies in Regina this morning. By way of a personal introduction, I always say that, you know, part of me will always be the gay prairie farm boy from Wapella, Saskatchewan. Even though I've lived in Toronto for more than 30 years, or almost 30 years, most of it with my partner, David Vereshegen. We met here, actually. Whenever I am gardening or cooking, which I do a lot of, I'm still channeling my mother and my grandmother's, you know, these prairie farm wives. And the formative aspect of being from a small town, and particularly the small town pastor who came to Wapella in my adolescence, was really an inflection point in my life. I really became much more religious because of that confirmation experience with Pastor Jim. Our family, of course, was culturally Lutheran by virtue of our Eastern European German background, but after confirmation, I took this faith and religious identity to a whole new level. And I think I can safely say that I'm the most religious person in our family now, and I'm truly a church nerd. I love travel as well, and have built connections, you know, with friends and the global Wushke family in Brazil and Germany, and was just in Germany for a couple of weeks to attend the ordination of a distant cousin, another gay Lutheran actually from Brazil, who is the next pastor in our family. And also, I've been living with HIV for decades, since testing positive in 1990, and was actually on long-term disability with HIV in the mid-90s. So with one foot in the grave, I was really pulled from the brink of death in 1996 when the new cocktail of antiretrovirals was introduced. I was able to go back to work and have been working for 30 years, and I hope I've been useful. So that's probably as much as people need to know about me.
So why don't we begin, if that's all right with everybody, with a few questions about your time here, Ralph, and about your experiences moving forward after the U of R. You were part, of course, of the University of Regina's very first graduating class, as we said in the introduction, And could you speak for a moment or two about what you remember most about your time at the U of R, and how did your education at the U of R in particular shape your life and your calling?
It's a great question, and unfortunately we don't have till midnight. So I actually started university, of course, in 1971 at the Regina campus of the University of Saskatchewan, and it was the year that Luther College opened. So I have such vivid memories of that first fall. I mean, I remember driving in, by myself to the university to register in August, I think it was, for my classes. And these were the times when, we were, how would I put it, free range kids. Like my parents, didn't, take me in to do that. I just had to drive in and figure it out by myself. And I remember how impressed I was with the University of Regina library that summer afternoon. And so when I think back on myself then, I was 17, I guess. On the one hand, I had a lot of confidence that I would do that, get in my car and drive off to university. But on the other hand, I was quite naive, and I'll talk about that a little more later, maybe. But Luther College actually was formative for me, because I lived in the residence for the entire 3 years of my BA. When I moved in, they were still laying the carpets. Everything smelled very new. And everything about Luther really was good for me. The social life, the experimental worship community, the chaplain, the faculty and the staff. It was very small faculty then, but I remember so well that the cooks, in the kitchen, they knew us all by first name, and it was really a very beautiful community. At the same time, there were a lot of lonely nights. As a very closeted gay man, when I came to university, I was really struggling with my homosexuality, and had suicidal ideation and so on, and was hoping that eventually I would wake up one day and feel attracted to women. I felt, but Luther was a safe place for me, and a kind place to me. The other thing that prepared me well, I think, is that I was a drama major and have great memories of going to drama classes. I mean, a lot of being a pastor is really about the performative aspects of worship, preaching, and so my drama studies at the old campus, I think, helped to prepare me for life and for my profession, actually.
I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit more. You were talking about your experiences at Luther, for example, and I've been thinking a lot too recently, actually, about my own experiences at Luther as an undergraduate student, and thinking about people, for example, like Roland Miller. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of speak a little bit more in depth about your experience at Luther and the U of R, and how they prepared you specifically for ministry and specifically for advocacy, if that's all right.
Sure. Well, as I may have mentioned already, my time at Luther and U of R was really a time of moving, I would say, from late adolescence into adulthood. This is not unique. Anybody who works in the university environment will have seen this, and I've watched this transformation in countless students as a chaplain at U of T. I arrived at U of R, a wet behind the ears farm boy, as I said, both confident and also naive. To give you an idea of how naive I was, I had no idea how a city bus worked, and I always was afraid that if you got on a city bus, how would it know when to stop? And so for years, I just didn't use the city buses because I didn't know how they would work. I also didn't have the courage to come out at Luther, and yet over those 3 years, I became very self-aware and grew in my self-acceptance as a gay man. By the time I left Luther, I knew that coming out was not a question of if I would come out, but when. I just was waiting for that right moment. And I actually remember, going in the U of R library and finding a couple of books on homosexuality, but I didn't want to sign them out, so I, sat between the stacks and read the books there. That was sort of how it was. But nevertheless, there was no doubt in my mind by the time I graduated that I was gay. Life might be difficult. I knew that homosexuals faced a lot of discrimination, but that was my lot, and I would have to lean into that. And I certainly didn't have that kind of self-awareness and understanding of the politics of being gay when I arrived. There was one class in particular, a Sociology 100 class, where the professor invited the founder of the University of Regina Homophile Association to be a guest speaker. So he was another student. And you know, I was sitting there in this classroom and I was thinking, my God, that's the first time I've actually knowingly seen like another homosexual in public. I've just never forgotten that moment. Also at Luther, there was a really strong community of like young worship leaders, and we formed a singing group and acted together, and you know, went around the province, you know, giving concerts. That was very formative as well, and that was, you know, in the context of faith. So again, that prepared me for ministry. Also, I mean, there were also some great courses that really prepared me for seminary. I don't know if anyone here would remember the legendary Father Isidore Gorski from Campion College. I mean, he taught classes on Old Testament and New Testament as literature, and these were so helpful for me, and I can just remember his lectures vividly. I also took drama, Greek, and German, and these were all, you know, helpful foundations for seminary. So I think my entire, you know, BA and experience at U of R set me up well, not only for seminary, but also for life in the public eye, however modest that public would be.
Thank you so much for that. You're reminding me of my own undergraduate studies in religious studies here at the U of R and the classes that I took that sort of led me down the path that I'm currently on. I wonder if you could speak for a moment about the Queering Religion program as the individual who founded it. What inspired you to start the program? What impact has it had on participants and broader faith communities?
Yes, thanks. I mean, just to say Queering Religion, to unpack that a little bit, it was a program for students, so a non-academic program, kind of like a club really, at the University of Toronto, and it operated to some degree on all three U of T campuses, but mostly on the downtown St. George campus. I became the chaplain, or one of the chaplains at U of T in the late fall of 2004, and I just finished what's called a THM, so a graduate degree in theology, and the focus of my studies was, you know, queer theology, postmodern hermeneutics, and also reflecting on my life as a gay activist and an HIV activist. And so when I started there, even some students in the Toronto School of Theology said to me, you know, there's no place for us. You know, there's no voice for queer theological students or queer students of faith. So in January 2005, I just made it my business to pull together a few students, and we started meeting under this, you know, name, Queering Religion. It just seemed so intuitive to me based on my studies and my past and the need that I was hearing. So for the next, you know, 14 years, and even after that, after I retired, QR, as it became popularly known on campus, met, you know, either monthly or bi-weekly, every year, always unique programs with, you know, panelists, film series, history presentations, and so on. So hundreds of students actually went through the QR program, and some of them, you know, who led, you know, provided the student leadership, because I always said my job as a chaplain was to make students look good. So I, you know, tried to hand over the leadership and the planning to students, but always being there to backstop their planning and find the resources. So hundreds of students took part in those programs, and, you know, there were already at U of T at that time, lots of queer clubs. I mean, every faculty had a queer club, you know, arts, law, engineering, and so on. But there was no space and there were lots of religious clubs, you know, many, many religious clubs. But there was no space at the nexus of religion, faith, spirituality, and queer lives and experience. So QR was a place that honored both. You know, you could bring your religious identity into the space, and at the same time, your queer identity would be celebrated and honored rather than dissed, right? So for so many students, that was just a huge support in their lives, and I really consider it my most important legacy. And I'm still friends with many of the students who took part in that program.
Thank you so much for that. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about pride and what it means to you personally as someone who's lived through pivotal moments in queer history, as somebody who founded, for example, the Queering Religion program at the U of T.
Well, Pride is obviously about many things, and I do have to say, I mean, we're in what we now call Pride Month, but I remember in 1988 and 89, there was a group in Regina. I was living and working in the Capel Valley at what was called the Prairie Christian Training Center then, and we had a very active queer human rights working group in Regina called EGAL, named after the National Movement Equality for Gays and Lesbians Everywhere. And we were a force to contend with. We met with cabinet, we met with MPs, we gave interviews, and we wanted to organize a Pride, festival and a Pride march from City Hall, Regina, to the legislature to have a program. And the City Hall refused to give us a permit to walk. And warned us that we'd be fined if we walked down Albert Street. So it was a time of just unexamined discrimination, and many of the people who were walking in the march felt insecure as far as their employment and identity. So most people were walking with masks because they couldn't didn't really feel safe walking in a Pride march. So looking back on that experience almost 30 years ago, it was Pride was really about really claiming the right to be at a very basic level, and I think we often think of the queer rights movement as a chronological thing, but it actually isn't completely chronological. There are many people in Canada, in Toronto, Regina, and around the world who are just beginning to claim that identity and figure out who they are. So Pride for people who are queer and 16 or 19, just claiming their trans identity or their non-binary identity, Pride is the first time that they might test that out on the streets, and maybe hoping that nobody from their city will come down into to see the march. So it can be a very existential and personal moment of identity building. At the larger political level, Pride is still about human rights. Queer human rights are actually more under threat now than they have been for a while, especially, but not only in the United States. Everything's been rolling back. Trans people are living with fear, and many other countries around the world. So, long story short, I think Pride is still about singing, marching, and fighting for our lives, and also about the right to love whoever you want, and about a healthy eros and an eros positivity in our society.
Thank you for that. So one last question, a couple of last questions, if it's all right, before we open things up to our attendees, the people who are joining us for questions and comments. I'm wondering, for example, if you could speak for a moment about your career as you reflect on your career. Thinking back, for example, all those years ago now at the U of R and moving through into where you are today. What do you feel you're most proud of? What hopes, for example, do you carry for the future of inclusive ministry and inclusive education?
It's easier to answer the first part because I think one of my personal mottos is self-descriptors, I guess, is that my role in life is to bring good people together and sort of give them the power that comes from that interaction. So, in my early parish ministry in rural southeastern Saskatchewan, my life, or my career as a AIDS executive director in Saskatoon, and then, at the university working with students and for so many years, and even, my parish ministries of late. I always like to see the potential in people, and when new people arrive or when people join, the club, the congregation, whatever, I'm very quick to invite them to be insiders and say, would you like to try this? Or would you like to work with this person to do that? And in most cases, that's very empowering. So I really believe in sharing power, not being sort of a controlling pastor, but opening up possibilities for people, and being surprised by what happens when good people come together. I always say a group of, in a church context and in other contexts, a group of good people working together is always much greater than the sum of their parts, right? My hopes for the future, well, I certainly hope that things don't roll back in Canada, with the, the growing voices of the new right, the alt-right. That's always a concern. So that's one concern. I hope that more religious groups will continue to wrestle with and move in the direction of affirming the lives and concerns of queer people, queer and trans people. I've always said, as you look at the Christian denominations, that's the groups that I'm most familiar with in Canada, many of them have come to that point of acceptance. The United Church of Canada got there first in the 80s already, and the other denominations are getting there one by one, particularly the liberal mainline churches. But they all move at their own pace. So the Presbyterian Church, just got there a couple of years ago. The Reformed Church, is still working on this, or the activists are. The Mennonite denominations, of which there are many, are moving in there at their own pace as well. So I've always said that change on this matter, on queer acceptance, welcome, and affirmation, happens congregation by congregation, family by family, and denomination by denomination, working with their own resources in their own pace, on their own timetable. And I hope that will continue. I'm just about to be interviewed for a PhD thesis on this very topic. It's called Queer Futures, about the lives and experiences of clergy, pastors and ministers in Christian denominations in Canada. So that's that's another small piece of this work that makes change over time. Thanks.
So if I might ask one last question, you just mentioned that you're about to be interviewed for a PhD dissertation on this subject. So I'm wondering if you could speak to something about your time as a student, those formative years at the U of R in particular, when you think back to being a student, and how your persistence and how that relates to your persistence in terms of advancing LGBTQ2 rights.
I think when I think back to my time at U of R, and when I think about what it's like today, I mean, I walked campus twice last year. Actually, I was there for a Lutheran Anglican conference in July and then Union in October, and you can just tell that it's a different world from what it was in the 70s, right? I mean, pride, or positive space, branding everywhere, and queer clubs and so on. So there's just so much more openness there than there was then. So it was kind of lonely, I would say, and this is before the age of social media of any kind, and so you couldn't find people. It was hard to find other queer people. You'd look at someone, you say, I wonder if they're gay, and you would have no way of knowing, right? So in one sense, that was lonely. I mean, one time and just to give you an example, when I heard that there was this University of Regina Homophile Association that had been formed in the office, was in the classroom building, I decided I would go and check out this group, and I was just trembling with trepidation as I approached the door of the University of Regina Homophile Association. There I found it, and I knocked on the door, and no one answered. And I was kind of relieved that I didn't have to come out, So that is, well, I was very relieved, actually. So, that gives you an idea to how dramatic the tension was. But at the same time, I really am a deeply religious person. And for me, this idea that, at Luther College, we painted this slogan on the student lounge wall one year that said, I am me and I am good, because God don't make no junk. Now, very bad grammar, but it's really a sort of a hip reflection of this idea of God's grace, God's unconditional love, God's acceptance, and that teaching, or those teachings which are core to Lutheran faith and theology and other denominations as well, was really what sustained me. Like throughout, those years of mixed emotions at Luther, the years at seminary, which were also, very challenging, in the way human sexuality was taught from an ethics perspective, was not positive in my view. And even my early years as a closeted pastor in rural Saskatchewan, and then my years as a HIV positive AIDS activist. I mean, it was God's love, God's grace that was my foundation the whole time, and I just can't really speak enough about that inner life as a foundation, or as one leg of the four-legged stool that we need for an effective life.
Thank you so much for that. I'm hoping, if it's all right, we can perhaps open things up to attendees, to any questions or comments people might have. And so we'll give everybody a moment. If you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to post it in the chat. You can raise your hand as well. Or if you'd like to make a comment or share a comment through the chat or by raising your hand, please feel free to do so. I have a question, if it's all right, in the meantime, if I'm not dominating the conversation too much. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit also about your time at the U of R, at the U of T and the U of R. Alexis has a question for you, so we'll start with that, if that's all right. Asking and saying, thank you so much for sharing your journey, Ralph, and wondering what advice you would give to young queer students, young queer individuals who are struggling to reconcile, for example, faith with identity, that concept of belonging with identity vis-a-vis religiosity, spirituality, or faith.
Sure, it's a great question. And I mean, I've encountered this, at a pastoral level many times in my work as a chaplain and as a pastor. And one of the themes, that has come up a number of times as young, mostly closeted queer students come to me is this existential fear, like, is it true that I'm going to go to hell? Like, do I have to choose between, eternal life in heaven or having sex now? Like, are those the choices that are facing me? I mean, it's that existential, right? And I can think of several conversations that went kind of down that path. And, I would just say, like, listen, God loves you. God accepts you. God rejoices at your love and your eros, really. And, I just try to be so clear about this message of grace and love. And there's a former student who goes back like 15 years, who's now a really well-established professional, who comes to Toronto from another city and takes me for breakfast and recounts that encounter, when he came to me full of religious fear and trusted, that my words were going to work for him. So that's one way at a very sort of very practical, personal level. It is contextual. I mean, sometimes you just have to, not be so directive. Some students are very much, young queer students and people are very much, caught in the family context, the conservative religious context. And even though I believe it would be better, for them to come out, they're economically dependent on their family, right? And live in an outer suburb of the Greater Toronto area. So you can't just say, oh, come out and everything will be happy or better for you. So it's a question of accompanying them and helping them discern, when they could be autonomous enough to actually come out and stand on their own without the family support.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of things that are being typed into the chat. We'll give it a moment for them to pop up. But I'm wondering in the meantime, if you could speak about, if you can think of, for example, a couple or speak to, just while we're waiting for those questions to come up or comments to come up in the chat, if you could speak to perhaps one of those, if it's all right, sharing perhaps one or two of those most meaningful conversations or experiences that you've had vis-a-vis the role you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps elaborating just a bit more on what you've just been mentioning.
These things sort of fall under the rubric of pastoral confidence, even though it's, decades ago or many years ago. But for example, one student who I was quite close to came to me once in a total panic, and he was afraid he might have contracted HIV. So he had to go for the test, the free testing here near the university, and he had to go for the results. You couldn't get the results unless you went back. And so, and he's a person of deep religious faith as well. So I just accompanied him that whole, 10-day period. I went with him when he had the test. I went with him when he got the test results, and they were negative, so big relief. But that's a very frightening process. So I literally accompanied him through that entire experience. A lot of also, I was located at two seminaries at U of T, the United Church and Presbyterian seminaries, and it may surprise people to know that a lot of people came to me, if they trusted that the information wasn't going to go any further, to come out. And to come out as trans, and to come out as polyamorous. So, I'd have students, come in and say, where do these conversations go? And I said, well, they don't leave this room. And then people would talk about their, non-ethical monogamy, which, in the religious context, red flags go up. But I can think of 2 or 3 people who began their transgender journey, who came to me at, near the beginning of that, and wanted theological resources, like what are some scriptural or faith resources that support the transition that I'm going to go through. And so then we can talk about the God who is multi-gender. We can talk about gender nonconformity in scripture, which there are many good examples. The first baptized Christian was the Ethiopian eunuch, so a gender nonconforming person of color, right? Just to name an example. So those are, some specific examples, but I can certainly, as I say, think of, a good handful of people who, began their coming out process in my office.
Thank you so much for that. So this is, I think for me, reading the question that's in the chat from Tatum is a bit of a follow-up actually to this. So Tatum writes, thank you, Ralph. I am the registrar at Luther, and I've really appreciated your kind words about our college. We continue to do our best to offer a supportive home for our students. Do you have any advice or thoughts for the staff who work with young people in, let's say, a university setting, for example? We always want to ensure we provide a safe space here at Luther.
Great question. I think it's so important to send signals, right? So most, or not most, but many students who will show up who are at some point in their life going to be more openly LGBTQ or trans, may be nowhere near that that part of their lives, but they're thinking about it, they're processing, and so as they come to Luther or any professional's office, they're looking for signals like, would this be a safe place? Like, what's the vibe here? So to have some books on your bookshelf that have queer positive titles on them, of which there are many. I mean, I have 12 linear feet behind me. To have postering, like the positive space poster, is just so important. And then language too. I mean, when professionals are talking, if they have queer friends in their circle, you can drop that into a conversation. But long before someone's going to talk to you about that dilemma, they're going to need to know that you're safe or safer.
And if I might follow up on that question for myself personally, if that's all right. I'm wondering if you've talked about, for example, and Tatum has responded, perfect, thank you, which is what it was this conversation, these last couple of moments that have me asking this as well. You've provided some wonderful advice for staff who are working with the U of R, with students, but how do people who are teaching in the classroom and doing research, if you will, do that as well? And then also, Jennifer's asking a question and saying, your discussion is very much appreciated, Ralph. I'm not sure how involved you are in social media or other online discussions, but if so, how do you deal with disparaging comments from, for example, keyboard warriors who, quote, hide behind their screens, end quote, or in other presentations, perhaps in person, those, for example, who are ignorant.
Okay, let me try to keep both of those questions in mind. I'll go to Jennifer's first here. I am, pretty active on social media. I mean, I post occasionally, and will comment occasionally. I mean, and I think the algorithm, Instagram and Facebook prevents me from seeing really awful stuff. I mostly, see stuff in my own sort of silo. So, I haven't had to deal with much hate there. I mean, I've had, a couple of people, even in my, personal circles, like my high school circles from rural Saskatchewan, post, what I considered inappropriate and negative comments. After a couple of interactions, I just said, okay, I'm done, you're blocked, so, I mean, a really interesting example, I mean, this does still happen, believe it or not, in my parish here in Toronto. A student approached me, a new U of T first year student approached me about, coming to the church and maybe practicing on a musical instrument. And I said, well, you're welcome to come, that'd be great. But I just want you to know, we are a welcoming and queer positive congregation. Just so you know, I mean, this is a young international student from a very evangelical background. He told me that. And so when I said that we were welcoming, he said, oh, well, I really disagree with that. I really disagree with that. And I said, well, you're welcome anyway. So in the event, he and two other young, evangelical Christian friends arrived, stayed for the whole service. They even brought food for the potluck lunch. But afterwards, this young fellow took me aside and said to me, Pastor, I really hope that you will, reconsider your lifestyle and, follow God's will in Scripture, because your lifestyle is sinful, something like that. And I was dumbfounded at the temerity of, a 17 or 18-year-old Christian evangelical telling a 71-year-old gay man that I should reconsider the decisions I've made in my life. I mean, I held my ground with them and just said, like, no, and, I have another understanding of Scripture, and I hope one day you will too. I mean, it didn't end badly. I mean, we've had other actual email exchanges, so I didn't want to burn bridges with him. But there you go, right? I mean, and that's what I mean when I say, the movement for queer liberation or LGBTQ liberation is not linear or chronological. In some ways, it's much harder in some places today to come out than it was for me in 1978. I mean, my coming out was pre-AIDS. There was no AIDS panic. There was no gay bashing because of, the AIDS virus. So because of all the education that we've had in the last 4 decades, there's actually more homophobia as well, because people hear about this, reality and take their side, When I came out to my father and mother in 1978, my father had never heard of homosexuality, like never. So he was a blank slate. Like there was no homophobia because he didn't know there were gay people. So everything, he got to learn about gay people, he learned through me. And to your question, Michelle, about what academics can do, again, I mean, the one thing that comes to mind is small signals, wearing, a pride pin during Pride Week or something like that. And then also the readings that you choose, right, in your syllabi. I mean, what are, how do you give space for queer lives and experience, queer theology? I mean, especially for you teach religion, and I know you teach, sort of a multi-spectrum, view of issues in different world religions. So how do you, can you lift up the topic of sexualities, genders, and how they are, perceived and handled in all of these religions? So just by the fact that you're doing that, I mean, all of the material that comes up may not be queer positive per se, but the way you raise it and shows that you are open to the discussion, and that this is a topic that you don't want to hide, but you want to bring forward.
Thank you so much for that. We are at time. Jennifer's saying thank you in the chat, as did Tatum and Alexis, and I would as well say thank you. I would say thank you again for coming in to speak to my students in the fall. It was, as I've said to you, an incredibly important conversation and talk for them to have. This has been a really important conversation as well. And it's been my pleasure to join you and to help facilitate this conversation. We will wrap things up here because we are at time. I want to take a moment. Helga is saying in the chat, so appreciated you sharing your experience as well. I just want to again say thank you to you. Thank you to everybody for joining us today and contributing to our conversation. Thank you again, Ralph. I can't stress this enough for sharing your story and your time with us and with students at the University of Regina and the Federated Colleges. A video recording as a reminder of today's Alumni Effect is going to be posted soon to the alumni section of the website. You can see the link here again to the website in the chat, and please feel free to share this with family, with friends again, and with others. And please don't forget to check out the University of Regina's website and the alumni social media channels for information about upcoming events in this series and more. Today's conversation, today's session concludes this year's Alumni Effect virtual speaker series. And so we want to take a moment to thank all of our alumni speakers, all of our presenters, and thank everyone who has attended today, but also throughout this year's series. And we encourage you to rewatch any of the recordings. There is great content from fantastic alumni speakers. I will wrap things up. We will wrap things up here. I will wish everybody well. Please do take care and have a lovely summer. And Ralph, please.
Yep. Well, let me add my thanks to you, Michelle, and the organizers. And I just want to say, people see my name. Contact me on social media if you wish. I mean, I'm happy to hear from people and continue to engage.